The podcast begins by discussing the current state of Joe Biden's presidential campaign. With Congress back in session, Democrats are now facing questions about whether Biden should remain the nominee. Ben Shapiro emphasizes that Kamala Harris is currently the most important person in the country, as she may either take over the presidency now or become president if Biden wins, but is unable to serve. The podcast discusses Biden's recent public appearances and interviews, highlighting his struggles. In a rally in Wisconsin, Biden mistakenly said he would beat Donald Trump again in 2020, suggesting either a mental problem or access to a time machine. Shapiro notes that according to a CNN survey, 75% of voters believe the Democratic Party would have a better chance against Trump with a different candidate. The podcast then focuses on Biden's interview with George Stephanopoulos. Shapiro describes the interview as a disaster area, noting that Biden's voice sounded weak and he wandered randomly all over the verbal landscape. When asked if he was the same man he was when he took office, Biden struggled to provide a coherent answer. Shapiro points out that the audio quality of the interview was poor, likely due to Biden speaking so softly that the microphones had difficulty picking up his voice. The podcast discusses the growing concerns within the Democratic Party about Biden's ability to win the election. Some Democrats, including Representatives Jim Himes, Jamie Raskin, and Don Beyer, have expressed doubts about Biden's chances. Shapiro notes that there is increasing pressure within the party for Biden to step aside, but Biden remains stubborn and unwilling to drop out. The podcast mentions that some Democrats are preparing to publicly urge Biden to call off his re-election bid, while others want party leaders to nudge him out. However, there is also a split within the party, with some Democrats defending Biden and warning against the consequences of forcing him out. Shapiro emphasizes that Kamala Harris is now the most important person in the country, as she could potentially replace Biden on the ticket or become president if he wins, but is unable to serve. He notes that Harris is hedging her bets, avoiding mentioning Biden's name in recent appearances. The podcast also discusses the media's attempts to generate enthusiasm for Harris, despite her failed presidential campaign in the past. The podcast shifts to discussing Donald Trump's campaign strategy. Shapiro suggests that Trump has changed his approach in 2024, being more careful with his statements compared to previous campaigns. Trump is reportedly begging Biden to stay in the race, seeing it as advantageous to his campaign. Shapiro mentions that Trump was supposed to announce a VP candidate, but is now waiting until right before the Republican National Convention. The top three candidates for Trump's VP are reportedly Doug Burgum, J.D. Vance, and Marco Rubio. The podcast then turns to international news, discussing the recent French parliamentary elections. Shapiro explains that Emmanuel Macron's centrist party decided to side with the far-left communists rather than the right-wing National Rally Party. This decision led to a surprising victory for the leftist coalition, despite National Rally winning the largest share of the popular vote. Shapiro criticizes Macron's decision, arguing that by siding with the communists, Macron's party is no longer truly centrist. The podcast also mentions the riots that followed the election results, noting that left-wing supporters celebrated by setting off fireworks and climbing statues, leading to clashes with riot police. The podcast briefly discusses the recent UK election, where Keir Starmer's Labour Party won a majority in Parliament despite receiving a smaller share of the vote than the combined right-wing parties. Shapiro plays a clip of Starmer receiving a congratulatory call from Joe Biden. The podcast notes that Starmer's first actions as prime minister include plans to reduce prison sentences and abandon the previous government's Rwanda deportation policy for asylum seekers. Shapiro expresses concern about these policy changes and their potential impact on crime and immigration in the UK. The podcast concludes by emphasizing the importance of understanding Kamala Harris's background, given her potential to become either the Democratic nominee or the president if Biden wins. Throughout the podcast, Shapiro maintains a critical stance towards Biden and the Democratic Party, while also expressing concerns about the political developments in France and the UK. The overall tone suggests skepticism about Biden's ability to continue as the Democratic nominee and win the general election, while also highlighting the potential consequences of left-wing victories in European elections.